The first thing everyone learned about him was to lower their voice when he entered a room. Conversations softened, laughter thinned, spines straightened. Men who ruled streets and ports and entire neighborhoods checked their words twice before speaking to him. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not need to. His power was quiet, precise, and absolute, built on a modern empire that hid behind shipping companies, real estate firms, private clinics, and charities that bore his name but never his fingerprints. Money moved when he decided it would. People disappeared when they forgot who he was. He was known for discipline, for control, for never letting emotion touch the decisions that kept him alive. Women to him were ornamental. They arrived in silk and perfume, laughed on command, posed for photographs, and left before morning. They were never invited into his mind, never trusted with his secrets. In his world, closeness was weakness, and weakness was fatal. His office reflected that philosophy: glass walls, steel surfaces, a view of the city that looked less like something to admire and more like territory to be watched. From that height, everything seemed manageable. People were reduced to movement and numbers and patterns. He liked it that way. She sat just outside that office every day. Most people did not notice her at all. She wore thick glasses that dulled the sharpness of her eyes, loose sweaters that hid her shape, neutral colors that blended into walls and furniture. Her hair was always pulled back, severe and practical, as if beauty were an inconvenience she refused to allow. When visitors glanced at her, it was with mild confusion, the way one looks at a coat rack or a printer, something necessary, something forgettable. The jokes came quietly when they thought she could not hear. Ugly secretary, mouse, ghost. She heard everything. She learned early that visibility was dangerous. In this building, in this world, being seen meant being evaluated, tested, claimed. So she perfected invisibility with the same care other women applied to makeup. She made herself smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss. And while they dismissed her, she ran everything. She knew which meetings were real and which were theater. She memorized codes without writing them down. She rerouted shipments with a single email, adjusted schedules to avoid ambushes, delayed calls that would have ended in blood if answered too soon. When crises erupted in the middle of the night, it was her number that rang first, not his. She handled them before they ever reached his door. He never asked how. He never asked why his calendar always flowed so smoothly, why deals fell apart before becoming threats, why problems dissolved without explanation. He assumed it was efficiency, competence, replaceable labor. Furniture did its job best when you didn't think about it. She brought him his coffee every morning, set precisely where he preferred it, at the exact temperature he liked without ever having said it out loud. She spoke only when spoken to, voice steady, neutral, professional. When his temper flared, she absorbed it without reaction. When men twice her size shouted in the reception area, she met them with calm eyes and polite smiles that somehow made them back down. Humiliation lived quietly in her chest, never allowed to rise to the surface. She swallowed it the way she swallowed fear, the way she swallowed the knowledge that one mistake in this building could cost more than a job. She endured. What no one noticed was how often she listened. How her eyes flicked to reflections in glass when voices dropped too low. How she recognized patterns in speech, in footsteps, in silence. how she understood the difference between a threat and a bluff long before fists were raised or guns were drawn. She knew which charities were real and which were laundering money, which alliances were fragile, which men were lying about loyalty. She knew who would betray him and, more importantly, when. She knew things that could destroy empires. And she kept them locked behind thick lenses and plain clothes, and a posture that invited underestimation. The Mafia boss rarely looked at her. When he did, it was with the same brief acknowledgement he gave to doors opening on time or lights turning on when flipped. Useful, expected, unremarkable. He did not see the restraint it took for her to remain quiet. He did not see the intelligence sharpened by fear and discipline. He did not see the woman who had chosen invisibility not because she lacked worth, but because she understood power better than anyone in the room. No, not yet. But the city had a way of forcing revelations. And the most dangerous secrets were always the ones hiding in plain sight. The decision came without ceremony, the way his most dangerous choices always did, quietly, efficiently, without warning to anyone involved, including himself. He stood at the window watching the city pulse beneath him, lights like veins of power, when the call came through that his usual companion would not be attending the dinner that night. A donor, a judge, two rival intermediaries, all waiting, all expecting the image of control perfection. And excess he was known for canceling was not an option. Arriving alone was. Weakness. He turned without thinking and spoke the first solution that required no effort. "You will come with me tonight." The words landed in the room like a loaded weapon. His secretary looked up slowly, as if confirming she had heard correctly. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. She held her face, remained calm, but something flickered beneath the thick lenses, a flash of fear she buried instantly. She had learned how to do that very well. "I am not suitable for that kind of dinner," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady. He dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. Suitability was a costume, and he could buy those easily. What mattered was obedience, intelligence, and silence. She had all three. "You know the players, you understand the conversations. I need someone who listens, not someone who performs." He did not look at her when he said it. He did not notice the way her shoulders stiffened or how her breath caught for half a second before she answered, "Of course." When she returned to her desk, the building felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. She stared at her reflection in the darkened glass of her monitor, seeing the woman the world saw, plain, forgettable, safe. And beneath that, the woman who understood exactly why this invitation was dangerous. Visibility in his world was not a privilege, it was exposure. She had survived by avoiding it for years. Memories stirred, uninvited nights when attention had turned sharp, and hungry moments when being seen had meant being chosen, and not in ways that ended well. She had learned then that power rarely protected women like her, it consumed them. She opened his calendar and began adjusting everything, automatically building buffers, mapping exits, rerouting drivers, marking names she would need to remember. She checked seating arrangements twice, noting who would be present and who should not be trusted. She flagged a quiet risk, someone who had shifted alliances recently, someone he had not yet identified. She considered warning him, then stopped. He did not ask for warnings from furniture. The afternoon passed in controlled motion. He issued orders, she executed them flawlessly. A shipment delayed, a meeting postponed, a threat neutralized before it reached the surface. He remained unaware that while he prepared for a dinner meant to project dominance, She was quietly calculating how to keep him alive through it. As evening approached, the tension in her chest grew tighter. She left the building later than usual, slipping into the crowd unnoticed. As always on the street, her reflection followed her in dark windows, thick glasses, muted colors. A woman no one would remember tomorrow, she told herself. That was still the plan: to attend, to observe, to disappear again. Yet something about the way he had said "you will come with me" lingered in her mind, not command, not cruelty, something careless almost, as if he had reached for the nearest object without realizing it was not an object at all. Across the city he stood alone, adjusting his cufflinks, expression unreadable. He felt an unfamiliar unease, a sense that he had moved a piece on the board. Without understanding its value, he told himself, it was nothing, he always did. Neither of them understood yet that the invitation was not a convenience but a fracture, the first crack in a structure built on control, and once cracked, nothing in his world would ever return to its original shape. She locked the door behind her and stood in the quiet of her small apartment, letting the silence settle over her like a held breath. The city hummed outside, but inside everything felt suspended, as if the night itself was waiting for her to decide who she would be. She placed her bag down, slowly removed the thick glasses that had become armor over the years, and stared at her reflection in the mirror, not the woman the world knew, but the one she kept hidden, her eyes sharp, alert, filled with stories she never told. She had learned long ago that survival in his world required disappearance, that beauty invited possession and possession invited danger. So she folded herself inward, dulled her edges, softened her presence, until she became something no one thought to question. But tonight visibility was no longer a choice, it was a command, and commands in his world carried consequences. She opened the closet where muted colors lined up like obedient soldiers, and pushed past them, reaching for the garment she had not touched. Years' fabric wrapped carefully away as if it carried memories too heavy to leave exposed. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, not from excitement but from fear, because this was not about looking beautiful. It was about stepping into light that had once burned her. She remembered hands that lingered too long, eyes that measured her worth in silence, promises whispered by men who mistook attention for protection. That was when she learned to disappear. And she had been very good at it, too good now. As she prepared, she did not rush, she moved with intention, letting herself breathe through each step. Hair released from its tight prison, falling around her shoulders, skin uncovered slowly, as if reintroducing herself to herself. When she dressed, the mirror showed a woman transformed but not altered. This was not a costume, it was a truth she had buried for safety. She looked powerful, not loud, elegant, not fragile. And for the first time in years, she did not feel like prey. Still, fear curled low in her stomach because she knew what he represented and what standing beside him meant. Every room they entered would measure her, every glance would weigh her value, every rival would see her as leverage. She leaned forward, resting her palms on the sink, grounding herself, reminding herself that she knew this world better than anyone suspected. She had memorized its dangers, mapped its violence, anticipated its betrayals. She was not stepping into darkness unarmed, she was stepping in prepared. Across the city, he adjusted his jacket, impatient, unaware that while he waited she was shedding a skin he had never noticed. He expected efficiency, silence, obedience. What he would get was something else entirely, something that would fracture his certainty and expose a weakness he had spent his life denying. As she reached for the door, she paused once more, meeting her own gaze steady and resolved. Tonight she would not hide, tonight she would walk beside power, not beneath it, and whatever happened after would no longer belong to fear. He was already there when she arrived, standing beneath the warm glow of chandeliers that reflected off marble and crystal, the kind of place where power announced itself before a word was spoken. He checked his watch, irritation sharp in his posture. because she was never late. Not once in 3 years he turned when he sensed movement, not expecting anything more than the familiar, quiet presence. He dismissed every day, and then the world stopped. His breath caught without permission. His body reacted before his mind could correct it. The woman walking toward him did not belong to the category he had placed her in. She moved with a calm confidence that parted the room without effort, fabric flowing around her like a controlled flame. Her face uncovered, her eyes bright, alert, dangerous in their intelligence. Recognition did not come immediately because his mind refused to make the connection. He searched her features for familiarity and found only impact. Every instinct trained for threat and dominance misfired as something primitive and unmanageable surged through him. The room reacted, men turning, women whispering, attention bending toward her like gravity, and then she spoke his name softly, and everything shattered. He knew that voice. He had heard it every morning, filtered through obedience and professionalism. But now, stripped of armor, it carried depth, warmth, and steel all at once. His chest tightened as reality rearranged itself. This was his secretary, the woman he had never seen, the woman who had stood beside him for years unnoticed, was standing before him, transformed not into something new, but into something revealed. Control slipped for the first time in longer than he could remember, and the loss of it terrified him more than any rival ever had. They entered the dining room together, and every step felt like walking into a trap. He could not map conversations, faltered eyes followed them, alliances recalculated in silence. He felt it then, the dangerous instinct rising sharp and territorial, the urge to shield, to claim, to assert ownership. Before anyone else could, she moved flawlessly, engaging when required, retreating when needed, her mind working faster than anyone else at the table, answering questions before they fully formed, deflecting probes with elegance and precision. He watched her closely, seeing the way she listened more than she spoke, the way her gaze tracked subtle shifts in posture, tone, intent. She was not just beautiful, she was formidable, and the realization hit him with quiet violence that she had always been this way. He had simply chosen not to see. He leaned closer than necessary, his hand resting at her back, a warning and a promise, and felt the tension in her body, not fear but awareness. Rivals noticed, one in particular watched too closely, eyes narrowing with interest and calculation, the kind of man who saw weaknesses and exploited them. He recognized the look because he wore it himself. His pulse slowed even as danger sharpened. He understood now that bringing her here had changed the balance of the night. She was no longer invisible, and in his world visibility came with a price. As the evening unfolded, applause, laughter, polite lies filling the air, he felt something unfamiliar and unsettling take root beneath his ribs. It was not desire alone, not possession alone, but the terrifying understanding that the most powerful asset in his empire had been sitting outside his office all along, unnoticed, unprotected, and now exposed. And for the first time, the thought of losing control did not feel like weakness, it felt like loss. The dinner deepened as the night matured, and with it the danger sharpened into something almost visible. He felt it in the way conversations bent toward her, in the way men who never deferred began asking questions meant for him, but aimed at her instead. She answered with measured calm, never revealing too much, never shrinking back either. Her voice carried confidence without arrogance, intelligence without challenge, and each word subtly reinforced his authority rather than undermining it. That alone unsettled him, because it meant she understood power not as spectacle, but as structure. She was reinforcing his position instinctively, or perhaps deliberately, and he could not tell which possibility disturbed him more. Across the table, a rival intermediary leaned back, studying her with the kind of smile that hid appetite. His gaze lingered too long, calculating value, leverage, risk. The boss noticed immediately and felt a dark instinct coil inside his chest. This was not jealousy the way lesser men felt it was assessment territorial awareness, the recognition of a potential threat forming in real time. He shifted slightly closer to her, not touching, yet unmistakably present. The message was clear to anyone watching. She was under his protection. She noticed too and adjusted without comment, redirecting the conversation, steering it away from sensitive ground, offering an alternative topic that kept everyone satisfied and distracted. He watched the precision of it, the way she controlled flow and timing like a conductor, guiding an orchestra. He realized then that she was not reacting, she was anticipating. She had been doing this for him for years from the shadows, and tonight the light revealed how much he had relied on her without knowing. When laughter broke out at the table, it felt forced and brittle beneath the surface. Currents shifting, alliances were being tested silently, and her presence was the variable no one had accounted for. The boss felt his control stretch thinner with every passing minute, not because he was losing dominance, but because he was gaining awareness of her value, awareness of her vulnerability. And with that awareness came fear, the kind he despised, the kind that threatened the walls he had built so carefully. Between courses, she leaned closer and murmured a warning low enough for only him to hear. The man to your left is fishing. He changed sides last quarter. He wants confirmation, not information. He stilled, keeping his expression neutral as the weight of her words settled. She was right, of course. He adjusted his response moments later, steering the conversation away from dangerous admissions. The rival retreated, satisfied and unaware of how close he had come. He glanced at her, then truly looked at her, not as a companion, not as an accessory, but as an equal mind working beside his. Her eyes met his, briefly steady, unafraid. And in that moment, he understood something he had avoided for years. Power did not only exist in dominance, it existed in trust, and he had entrusted her with more than he had ever admitted. But the room was watching, and whispers had begun to travel. He caught fragments of speculation, the beautiful woman beside him, the unknown history, the sudden shift. The underworld thrived on rumor, and tonight a story was being born, one that would not remain contained within these walls. He felt the inevitability of it pressing in the night, could not be undone, the visibility could not be erased. As the dinner drew toward its end, applause rose, polite and rehearsed. He stood offering his arm, and she accepted with a grace that felt natural, as if this had always been where she belonged. Cameras flashed discreetly from corners, sanctioned and unsanctioned alike. He knew images would circulate by morning, faces would be analyzed, narratives constructed. As they moved toward the exit, his jaw tightened with resolve. He had brought her into the light without understanding the cost, and now the cost would be collected not by enemies alone, but by the rules of a world that punished attachment mercilessly. He felt something settle in his chest, not regret, but recognition. The game had changed, and the most dangerous piece on the board was the one he had underestimated all along. Morning returned to the building like nothing had happened, yet everything felt altered, as if the walls themselves remembered the night before. She arrived early, as always, dressed once again, in the quiet uniform she had worn for years, thick glasses, plain clothes, hair pulled back tight, the goddess erased, replaced by the ghost everyone expected. She moved through security without comment, past men who nodded absently, unaware that they had watched her command a room only hours earlier. She sat at her desk and began working, fingers flying over schedules, communications, codes, crisis lists, as if routine could anchor her again. Yet beneath the calm, her chest felt tight, her pulse uneven, because she knew what visibility triggered in his world. And she had felt the eyes watching her as she entered the building. This time they lingered, not dismissive, not mocking, but curious, calculating. The invisibility she had built so carefully no longer Inside his office he stood staring at the city yet seeing nothing. He had slept little, his mind replaying moments. He could not explain the way her voice had carried authority, the way men had deferred without realizing why, the way power had shifted subtly around her presence. He told himself it was situational, a trick of lighting a reaction to novelty, yet when she entered to deliver his morning briefing, and he heard that same calm voice from behind the glasses, something inside him fractured. He looked up, and this time he did not look away. His gaze lingered, searching for the woman from the night before, and finding her deliberately concealed, the realization struck him harder than the reveal itself. She had chosen to disappear again, and the choice unsettled him more than exposure ever could. Throughout the morning he found reasons to leave his office, to stand near her desk, to ask questions. He already knew the answers to each time their hands brushed exchanging documents. A current passed through him, sharp and unwanted. He noticed how she avoided his eyes, how she resumed her role with flawless professionalism, as if the night had never happened. The control infuriated him because it mirrored his own. She had built walls as thick as his, and he had never noticed. The building hummed with quiet tension, whispers moving through corridors, fragments of rumors already forming. Someone had seen the photos, someone had recognized her face, though no one yet connected it to the woman behind the desk. He felt the danger tightening like a noose, and with it an emotion he despised, fear, not for himself but for her. By midday the confirmation arrived, encrypted messages from trusted sources, images already circulating among certain circles, speculation sharpening into intent. He dismissed his staff, closed his door, and stared at the screen where she appeared beside him, radiant, commanding, unmistakable. He understood then that she was no longer just his secretary, she was leverage. And in his world leverage invited blood. He stepped out and called her into his office, closing the door behind her, sealing them into silence. For a moment neither spoke. The power imbalance that had defined them shifted into something unstable. He wanted to tell her to hide, to retreat, to vanish again, but the words tasted like cowardice. He wanted to ask who she truly was, but feared the answer. She stood composed, waiting, as she always did, yet something in her posture had changed, an unspoken readiness, as if she anticipated the storm before it broke. He realized then that she already knew what the morning meant. She had calculated the consequences long before he had brought her into the light. And now the light had teeth. The question was no longer whether his world would change, but whether he would be strong enough to change with it. The warning did not come from him, it came from the silence that followed her out of the building that evening. The city felt closer, louder, as if it had leaned in to listen. She sensed him. Before she saw him, the man who had been watching her since the gala, the one whose gaze carried hunger and calculation in equal measure. He waited inside her favorite cafe, a place she had chosen years ago because it was neutral, ordinary, unremarkable places where danger usually passed her by. That illusion shattered the moment. He smiled and spoke her name as if it belonged to him. He did not introduce himself. She already knew who he was, the rival strategist, the man who never moved first, but always benefited when others fell. He spoke softly, his tone friendly, his words wrapped in concern. He praised her intelligence, her composure, her beauty, as if these were discoveries he had made himself. Then he planted the blade, carefully praising the boss as well before twisting it. Roman does not protect what he cannot control, he said, not unkindly. He elevates women, then hides them. When they become inconvenient, you are different, which is why you frighten him. She kept her expression neutral, though every word struck with precision. The man knew exactly where to press. He spoke of patterns of women brought close, then discarded, of alliances broken, because emotion weakened authority. He spoke of the night as if it had already been dissected by sharper minds than hers. Images were circulating, questions were forming, and in that world questions always demanded answers. He leaned closer, offering something dangerous disguised as kindness, safety, visibility, recognition. A place where she would not need to hide or beg for space. She felt the old fear stir, the one she had buried beneath discipline and silence. He had given her a truth wrapped in a lie. Roman had not claimed her publicly. And that absence echoed louder now. He had watched her step back into invisibility without protest, without explanation, and that silence hurt more than the danger ever could. The rival saw it and pressed gently, suggesting a future where she was valued, not concealed, where her mind was rewarded, not used in the shadows. She left the cafe without committing, without refusing, carrying doubt like a weight in her chest. The city watched her differently now. Reflections lingered, eyes followed. And every step felt measured by unseen hands. Back at the building, the atmosphere had shifted. People spoke more carefully around her. Glances lasted longer. She noticed small changes, security protocols, adjusted, conversations cut short. When she entered, she had become a variable, and variables made people nervous. That night she sat alone reviewing data. She had never intended to use patterns she had tracked quietly for months. Irregular trades, unusual movements, coded signals between factions. She had known a fracture was coming. She had simply not expected to be standing in its center. The rival was right about one thing: her presence had destabilized the balance, and balance was everything in his world. The question she could not escape was not whether she was in danger, but whether Roman would step forward or retreat when that danger reached for her. She had survived by disappearing. But survival was no longer enough. She wanted truth, clarity, choice. If he could not claim her openly, then she would claim herself, even if it meant walking into the storm alone. Outside the building, forces were already aligning, pieces shifting toward conflict. The rival smiled as he made his next call, confident that doubt was more destructive than any weapon. And somewhere above the city, Roman stood at his window, sensing that something precious was slipping beyond his control, even as he still did not know how to reach for it. The tension finally broke in the late afternoon when the office emptied into a hush that felt too deliberate. She stood at her desk, finishing the last adjustments with mechanical calm, every movement precise, restrained, as if emotion were something she had folded neatly and locked away. He watched her from behind glass for several minutes before stepping out. The distance between them suddenly unbearable. He spoke her name not as an order, but as a plea, and the sound of it made something in her chest tighten. She did not look up at first, because she knew if she did she might weaken. He asked why she had been distant, why she had pulled back, when the night had changed everything. She answered carefully, choosing truth over softness, telling him that what had changed for him had only exposed what had always been true for her, that she had been invisible by design, and that the one moment she stepped into the light, he had let her walk back into the shadows alone. The words cut deeper than any accusation because they were spoken without anger. Only clarity. He tried to explain, speaking of danger, of enemies, of protection. But the more he spoke, the more she understood that fear had been guiding him, not strategy, fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear of choosing something he could not control. She finally turned to face him, removing her glasses, slowly setting them on the desk between them like a line drawn. She told him she would not live half seen, half, claimed that she would not be a secret kept behind glass and locked doors. She asked him directly, not as his assistant, but as a woman, whether he intended to stand beside her openly or keep her hidden for convenience. The silence that followed answered before he could, and she felt the last thread inside her snap, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in resolve. She handed him the envelope she had prepared hours earlier, her resignation letter written with the same discipline she applied to everything she told him. She was leaving effective immediately, that she had accepted another offer, one that came with visibility, authority, and acknowledgement. He reacted instantly, anger flashing sharp and dangerous, accusing the rival of manipulation, warning her of consequences. But she did not flinch. She told him consequences were inevitable either way, and at least this choice would be hers. She said she deserved more than stolen moments and whispered promises. She deserved truth. He saw then how deeply he had misjudged her strength, and the realization came too late. As she turned to leave, something in him broke. The walls he had built to survive cracked under the weight of losing the one person who had known him without illusion. He confessed then, not with control, but with raw honesty, telling her the truth about his past, about watching love destroy his father, about building an empire to avoid that kind of pain. He told her he had hidden her not from shame but from terror, because making her visible meant admitting she was essential. She listened, tears threatening, but did not step back, because love without courage was still a cage. When the rival appeared in the doorway moments later, smug and certain, having overheard enough to think he had won, the room shifted into something volatile. The game had reached its edge. And she understood then that this was no longer just about love or fear, but power, truth, and choice. And this time she would not disappear to protect someone else. She would stand in the open and let the world see exactly who she was, even if it burned everything down. The air in the room turned heavy the moment the rival stepped fully inside, carrying confidence like a weapon he believed had already struck. He spoke calmly, explaining his plan as if victory were inevitable. Shares, alliances, whispers already seated among the council. He spoke of weakness and betrayal, and how easily power could be taken when emotion clouded judgment. He addressed the boss with a smile that dared him to react, knowing violence would only confirm the narrative being built against him. Then he turned his attention to her, calling her a prize, a catalyst, the beautiful mistake that had unbalanced everything he believed. She was the leverage he needed, and that belief was his undoing. She listened without interruption, letting him reveal more than he intended, the way men always did when they thought a woman was merely decoration. When he finished, she stepped forward, not hiding, not trembling, her voice steady, clear, commanding. She told him he had underestimated her from the beginning, that while he had been plotting takeovers, she had been documenting patterns, tracking money, mapping betrayals. She revealed she had recorded every conversation, every subtle threat, every attempt to manipulate her into believing she was disposable. She spoke of accounts he thought were invisible, of transfers hidden through shell fronts, of alliances forged in shadows. She named names, dates, figures with precision that froze the room. The confidence drained from his face as realization dawned that the quiet secretary had been watching all along. She reached into her bag and placed the evidence on the desk, not dramatically, not for effect, simply because it was time. She explained that she had not done this out of revenge or ambition, but preparation, because survival in their world demanded foresight. She had protected the boss for years without his knowledge, intercepting threats, neutralizing risks, keeping his empire stable, while he believed himself untouchable. The truth settled like a blow. He had not been the sole architect of his power. She had been the unseen foundation beneath it. The rival attempted to laugh it off, to threaten, to deny, but his voice faltered as the boss moved beside her, not in front, not behind. But with her, his presence was no longer about dominance, it was declaration. He told the rival to leave, that the council would see the evidence by morning, and that the game he had been so certain of was over. The threat in his voice was quiet, final, absolute. The rival backed away, fury and fear warring across his face, before disappearing into the corridor, already calculating his escape. Silence followed thick and charged. The boss turned to her, seeing her now fully, not as an assistant, not as a liability, but as the most formidable ally he had ever had. He acknowledged his failure to protect her openly, to trust her strength, to choose courage over control. He told her he would stand before the council and claim both his mistakes and his choice. He would not hide her again, even if it cost him power, because power without truth was already hollow. She met his gaze and felt something shift, not fear, not doubt, but certainty. She had stepped into the light and survived. She had spoken truth in a world built on lies. And whatever came next would be faced openly, together or not at all. The revelation had changed everything, and there was no path back into the shadows anymore. The council chamber filled before sunrise, men arriving in silence, faces, hard voices, low, the kind of gathering that decided who lived, who ruled, and who vanished without a trace. He entered without hesitation, his posture steady, his presence commanding, but something about him had changed. Those who knew him longest felt it immediately. The woman walked beside him, not a step behind, not hidden, not disguised. Her glasses were gone, her posture unyielding, her gaze level. She did not ask permission to stand there. She belonged. Murmurs rippled through the room as eyes fixed on her, some with recognition, some with curiosity, some with open calculation. He raised a hand, and the room obeyed, silence settling like a held breath. He spoke first, not with excuses, not with deflection, but with truth. He acknowledged the breach, the rumors, the vulnerability created by his own fear. He named the rival and exposed the attempted coup, placing the evidence before them with precision and restraint. There was no theatrics, only facts delivered with authority. The room shifted as understanding spread, alliances recalibrating in real time. Power did not fracture, it consolidated. Then he did something no one expected. He turned to her and introduced her by name, not title, not function. He told them she was the reason the empire still stood, that she had guarded it from the shadows for years without recognition, without protection. He said the weakness had never been loving her, the weakness had been hiding her. The council listened, because power listened when truth carried weight. Questions followed, sharp, probing, dangerous. She answered them all calmly, intelligently, revealing just enough to satisfy without surrendering control. They saw then what he had finally understood, that she was not a liability but an asset beyond measure. One by one, the doubts dissolved, replaced by acceptance, not because of sentiment, but because strength recognizes strength. When the meeting ended, the rival was finished, stripped of allies, exposed to consequences that would come swiftly, and without mercy. The empire stood intact, reformed by honesty rather than fear. As the room emptied, he took her hand openly, no longer concerned with watching eyes. There was nothing left to hide. Later, as the city woke beneath them, they stood together at the window where he had once believed control meant isolation. He told her he would spend the rest of his life earning the trust he had almost lost. He told her love was no longer something he would ration or conceal. She listened, then smiled softly, not in victory, but in peace, because she had already chosen herself and he had chosen courage. In the months that followed, her role became official, acknowledged, respected. She reshaped the empire from within, not through force but structure, discipline, foresight. The world adjusted as it always did to those who refused to be underestimated. They moved through it together, not as myth or spectacle, but as partners bound by choice. When he asked her to marry him, it was not in secrecy, not behind guarded doors, but in the open, where nothing could be taken back. She accepted without hesitation, knowing love demanded bravery from both sides. Their union became legend, not because of wealth or power, but because it defied the rules that said women must hide and men must harden. And so the invisible woman became undeniable, and the man who feared vulnerability became unbreakable, not because he ruled alone, but because he finally understood that the greatest power was standing beside him all along.